Hello and welcome to another IC Monitor tutorial. Today's tutorial will explain your options for live and file capture, meaning capturing data live from an interface or loading telegrams from files. We'll talk about interfaces, how to select them and identify them and what options you have. We'll show capture files and what you can do, saving them, loading them, or merging multiple together. We'll explain the capture chain, meaning how the IC Monitor handles telegrams upon capture, and show what information you have at your hands in the status bar and status view. In this tutorial, we'll go over all the options you have in the Live and File Capture group in the Capture tab. We'll start with Capture Interfaces, as interfaces are the source of our telegrams on the network. In here, we can select from which interface we want to capture telegrams. In my case, it only makes sense to pick this one, as it's the only one that's IPv4 enabled. Though it is possible to select and capture from multiple interfaces if your use case demands it. We can see some information about the interfaces that helps us identify them on the machine, like the device name, IP addresses, or MAC address. If those were to change, we could use the Update button to reflect the recent changes. You can also capture from different technologies, like in this case serial ports. So let's see what happens if I plug in a couple of serial ports. Nothing yet, but once we hit the Update button, the two serial ports will show. We can then set the technology-specific attributes and use them for capture. Depending on your licenses, you will also have various tapped devices available for capture, but that is a topic for another video. Making sure we have selected our IPv4 interface, and we close this dialog. The next functions in the Live and File Capture group are rather straightforward. We can start a live capture and stop it. And since we enabled auto-scroll, we'll always be at the end of the telegram list. And thus we can see there's a capture going on. Though depending on our settings, we might not always see this so easily. That's where the status bar comes in very handy. Here we can see the current capture progress and the captured telegrams. We'll learn more about the status bar later in this tutorial. Now let's insert some data in this capture. That'll make us identifiable. I'm just going to ping a device in my network and then stop the capture. So now that we have a capture and we might not want to immediately start analyzing it, we can save it to a file. This can be done through the quick access over here. Just pick a name and save the file. We can save it in multiple formats, pcap-ng or pcap, which both are supported by Wireshark. We can also save in the file dialog over here, saying Save Capture File. Or we can export settings and the capture data together, either with a quick access over here or in File, Export. Just make sure you check the telegrams checkbox over here. Capture files can of course be loaded as well, and again there are multiple options to do it. We can use the Load Capture File button in the Live and File Capture group. There's a quick access option, and we can go to File and say Load Capture File. Let's pick this variant for a change and load the trace from the analysis tutorial. As we can see, the number of captured telegrams has changed, and up here we can see the file name that we loaded. Now if we want to change the trigger and filter conditions and apply them to the capture, we can simply change what we need and hit reload. Triggers and filters will be explained in a different tutorial. If the monitor doesn't have a file to load from, and you're performing this on a live capture, it will then load the telegrams from a temporary capture file. You can also merge together multiple capture files using the Merge Capture Files button here. You can either pick them one at a time or all together. I'll pick the first, and then we can add some more using Group Select. We can rearrange these files in the order we need, or sort them by timestamp, or file names, or display path, and of course manually move them around as well. Now just before we merge, let's quickly check what content we expect. We have a traceroute, a regular ping, and some OPC packets. Now let's merge. Apply an ICMP display filter, and to see if we have the traceroute, we can quickly check the TTL field, and indeed, here it is with decreasing TTL values. If you want to start fresh, you can discard your capture. You'll get a warning that all the telegrams will be lost. Reset the display filter, and we can start fresh. Before we take a more detailed look at the status bar, it makes sense to get a rough understanding how the IC monitor processes telegrams. This also helps a great deal in understanding how to use the capture settings, which are discussed in separate videos due to their complexity. Every capture telegram goes through this, what we call capture chain, and we'll go through the steps and explain what they do. Now, if you perform a live capture, telegrams are stored in a capture buffer, and if the interface you selected produces them at a high rate, the capture buffer can overflow, though there are settings to optimize and mitigate this, but they're discussed in a different video. If you perform file capture, the telegrams directly are steered to protocol processing. Now, in the first stage of protocol processing, the capture triggers are checked, and all telegrams that don't match will be immediately discarded and be visible as discarded telegrams in your status bar. Afterward, the capture filters are applied, and non-matching telegrams are discarded as well. All telegrams that made it through triggers and filters will then be stored in the pcap or pcap-ng file that you configured. If no file was configured, the IC monitor will store it in a temporary pcap file. Configuring files especially make sense when performing a long-term capture, where you can then set up the IC monitor to store telegrams in equally sized pcap files. After storing two files, the capture handlers get active and export telegrams to various file formats or proprietary formats, or use them to trigger callbacks for API users. Finally, the telegrams will be visible in the graphical user interface. To examine the status bar, we'll need to start another live capture, but let's first note that the status bar says no active capture, and all the telegram counters are set to 0. If we then start the live capture, it'll say that in the status bar, and the progress bar shows us the percentage of telegrams that have been loaded and are displayed in the graphical user interface. The buffer shows the fill level of the buffer, which with my current network setup I have no chance of ever filling up, though this buffer can overrun if we apply very complex trigger and filter conditions that require a lot of processing time or in extremely busy networks. If that happens, the number of dropped telegrams would increase. Down here we can see how many telegrams have been captured and how many of those are displayed. Capture telegrams are very interesting when we can't see displayed telegrams due to filter conditions or display filters, and the displayed telegrams help us to judge if our display filter does make sense. If telegrams don't make it through triggers and filters, the discarded telegrams is increased. And to get a feel for how much data is moved through the network, we have the captured data stat and the current data rate. Time shows us how long the capture has been going on, or how long the capture is in the file that we have loaded. The same stats can also be viewed in the capture status view, along with your capture file configuration. That concludes our live in file capture tutorial. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see each other in the next tutorial.